what rate spring would you help a guy select for his particular application? How does he decide that?
Sure. We'd like to start with the total weight of the car. We'd like to also have corner weights if that's possible. More and more people have got 4-corner scales. If you can't do that, there's got to be a truck stop nearby. Roll that baby off the trailer, get a total weight, then roll the back tires off, get the front weight, and then, conversely roll the fronts off and get the back weight. Get that information to us. It's helpful to have the driver in the car when we're doing this. It's pretty important to do that. And then from there, let's talk about the combination. Let's talk about, everything from expected ET, the engine, transmission, gear, size of tire, type of tire, and then style of racing that you're going to do. I think it's fair to say that we would spring a car a little differently if we were going to be on a no prep surface than a prep surface. A radial tire car is going to get sprung differently than a slick tire car. So there's a lot of factors that go into it, but we've got a chart that helps us with that. On the website or in the catalog, there's a very accurate chart that will help us, get to a recommended starting spot. We generally hit that thing pretty well. If you don't have one of our catalogs, give us a call. Happy to work with you through that process, and we'll make sure that we get a catalog out to you. But it's available online as well. But again, it's dictated by a lot of factors, but a very straightforward process, Eric. So it's something that we do on a daily basis, really.
Good. What about when you mentioned spring rate? Is there something to be said about a linear spring rate versus a progressive spring rate, and how does that work? Sometimes I get people calling and they're wondering, they want a little bit more explanation on that because it confuses them a little bit, and maybe you could just touch on that for a moment.
Sure. When we talk about springs in racing, and specifically in drag racing, we have found that a linear spring rate works the best. And by that, we mean that the spring rate at 1 inch of compression, at 2 inch of compression, at 3 inch of compression remains the same. A spring will start to rate creep and go up a little bit as we get closer to coil bind. But what we really don't want is a spring that changes rate during its amount of travel or amount of compression. Specifically, when we check our spring at AFCO, we'll run the machine down 1 inch and then zero out the reading. And that takes all the gap out of the end coils, because there's always going to be a little air gap between where the coil terminated and the first revolution of the next coil. So, and the spring doesn't work in the first inch anyway. It operates in the second, third, and fourth inch. So we typically check the spring in the next inch, record it, go down another inch and record it. So now you're into the third inch. And you might even go one more inch just to make sure that you're seeing what you're seeing, because that's really probably where the spring's operating. So that gives us a rate of the spring. And essentially what rate means, it tells us how much force has to be put on that spring to compress it 1 measured inch. If we take a 100-pound spring as an example, that's going to tell us that you've got to compress that spring with 100 pounds of weight or force, whatever, to compress that spring 1 inch. So in our spring rater, the hydraulic unit would have to create 100 pounds of force to compress that spring in inch. So that's really kind of how that works. The progressive springs have a place in circle track racing, in very specific applications, specific parts of the race car, but not really something that we work with on the drag racing side. But linear rate is where it's at for the drag racing. Something that comes to mind, Eric, I want to touch on this. I've recently had some conversations with some folks about when we're adjusting spring, the concept of changing tension on the spring by adjusting the adjuster nut on the shock either up or down. More frequently I hear, well, I took some tension out of the spring by adjusting the shock down, and I took tension away by backing off the adjuster. All we really did is change ride height. That spring rate is still the spring rate. And I think it's important to know that if the car is too stiff, then that's going to require either a valving change or it's going to require a spring rate change. But just taking the adjuster and backing it off, turning it down the body of the shock will only lower the car. So just something there that kind of popped in that was relevant there maybe.
Excellent. Good points. And folks, don't forget our AFCO springs all come with a lifetime guarantee. So
nice little plug there.
If you ever have any issues with it, give us a call and we'll walk you through that process. But our springs are made of the highest qualities, and that's one of the main reasons why we offer that lifetime guarantee on them.
Yep. Hey, let me ask this one. I've got one teed up here while it's fresh. How do we determine the length again? I think of the spring more than the shock. We've talked about that. So talk to me about spring length. You covered shock length.
Sure. Okay. Well, typically a spring length is going to be dictated by a few things, but one of the most important is, can I even get this spring on the shock without having to bring in an extra device, I'll call it a spring compressor, to get this spring on the shock. So as a general rule of thumb, for example, a 4-inch stroke shock is going to take an 8-inch spring. If we tried to put a 10 or 12-inch spring on that, short of a stroke shock, we'd have to compress it before we get it on there. And it's, not something you could typically just do by hand. And it's also brings in the possibility of, if you have too long of a spring on the shock to begin with, you're going to be closer to coil binding that spring perhaps during the normal stroke range of that shock. So, but as a rule of thumb, our 4-inch stroke shock's going to run an 8-inch spring. A 5-inch stroke shock will run a 10, 12, 14-inch, 10 or 12. A 6, 7, and 8 on up spring, or stroke shock, we typically will run a 12 or 14-inch spring. We like to run as long of a spring as we can on the shock, just to give us, a full range of spring to use. The other factor, though, is also you don't want to have the spring so long that you've kind of handcuffed yourself out of some of the adjustment range in setting your ride height. So a good example would be if let's say you had a 14-inch spring on a 6-inch stroke shock, and you were lowering and lowering and lowering the adjuster nut on the spring, on the shock, and you still couldn't get that ride height down to the level that you wanted to. In that scenario, hey, you've got to drop her down 2 inches and go to a 12-inch. But those are some of the factors that go into deciding what length spring to run on the shocks.
For more information, visit us at afcoracing.com.